In this video, I'm going to show you the process of creating our non-representational color theory composition with two complementary colors. What are we actually doing for this project? So we're creating non-representational monochromatic painting using complementary colors. And what are we hoping to learn or practice by doing this? Well, in this project, you're going to explore creating the illusion of depth using color. This means that we're going to use desaturated color values made from complementary color mixing. Instead of relying on just black and white, we're going to learn how the opposites on the color wheel can build more complex and nuanced tones. We're going to learn brush control. So we're going to be using a square or an angled brush, and we're going to practice making clean, crisp lines. You're also going to get used to holding a brush, as it's different from a pencil because your hand can't really rest on the canvas like it can with a sheet of paper. You're also going to work on adjusting the pressure and the angle of your stroke to create those sharp edges and get even coverage. We're going to learn blending. So we're going to use similar values and we're going to blend them in strategic parts of the painting to create the illusion of depth. And then we're also going to work on paint opacity. So it's a common issue for students when you're new to painting, how to achieve a solid opaque color. And this project is going to help us work through that by using a strategy called a painted ground to minimize transparency issues, and it's going to help us with smooth blending as well. These following steps can be paused as you work through your project, and they also are going to help to give an overview of the rest of the video. So we're going to start by choosing a primary or secondary color to use as your base color. In my opinion, I feel like it's easier to choose the primary color as the base, but you can do what you like. And then once you've got your color chosen, you need to figure out what the complement is. So just a little review, the complement is the color that's across on the color wheel. So for example, the complement of blue, we draw that arrow across, the complement is orange, and the complement of red is green, and the complement of yellow is purple. So once you have your your color pair chosen, you're then going to paint your entire surface with the base color. After it dries, you'll transfer your geometric design onto your painting surface, and then you're going to begin mixing and painting in your values. I suggested in this project to start with the lightest or most saturated value and work towards the darkest, most neutralized value. However, normally with acrylic painting, we will do the opposite. We start with the darkest values and we work towards the lightest. But I felt that for ease of color mixing, it would be a good idea to flip that for this particular project. And you also are going to make sure that you're incorporating blending of two different values at least in specific areas of your painting to create more of the illusion of depth. Okay, let's get going and actually see this process in action. For the materials for this project, I'm using a canvas that's a square, and I also printed off the reference image from D2L to show me the different values that I'm going to need to mix. Now I'll talk a little bit about my acrylic paint set that I have. So in this set, I have a warm blue and a cool blue. I also have a warm and a blue yellow. I have a warm and a cool red as well. And the cooler one for all of those just means it has a little bit more blue in it. I also have black and white. I'm going to use most of these paints, but not all of them. So for this project, I'm going to use the warm blue, meaning that it's not very green. I'm going to paint my whole entire canvas using one color.
This is because it'll help me later so that I don't have to deal with issues of paint opacity, so where the paint isn't opaque enough. Having a colored ground helps me to kind of build layers up. So I'm going to use blue as one of my colors, and then the complement for blue is orange. So I'm going to use orange for my other color. But the blue directly out of the paint tube is a little bit too dark for what I'm hoping to do. So I've added a little bit of yellow to brighten it a little bit and quite a bit of white as well. So I'm gonna mix my paint on this little cardboard palette here, and then I'm just gonna paint the whole entire canvas in one color. So I'm gonna speed up the video a little bit here and show how I'm gonna paint the whole canvas using this light blue. And I also suggest to paint the edges of your canvas. If you are not using a canvas though, you're welcome to just use a piece of paper that will be able to handle getting painted, and use painter's tape to kind of paint it, to tape around so you can get crisp edges. And remember, we're using mostly square compositions, but if you're creating your own composition, then it might be a little different. I'm going to put that aside to dry. While I'm waiting for that to dry, I'm going to take that printout from on D2L, and I'm going to number the different values that I have in this piece. And I'm going to label I'm going to kind of compare and then label which ones I think are which. And then this is going to help me out a lot when I actually go to paint. Most of the kind of pre-made compositions are 5 to 7 values. And so if you're going to create your own, just kind of keep that in mind. We don't want to have a composition with just 3 values, or we don't want to have something with, 15 values, as that can get quite complex and kind of beyond the scope of this project. Okay, my canvas is dry, and so what I want to do now is just draw some guidelines for myself. I'm going to use a ruler for this, and I'm just going to kind of duplicate the design that's in the reference image. If you're creating your own design, then you just replicate your own design. The other thing that you can do if you're not using a canvas um, is you can use the transfer method of where we shade the back of our reference image and then we place it on top of our paper and we trace over it, similar to what we've done in previous assignments. Um, but with a canvas, though, it's difficult to do that method, but it's not impossible. So here I am just kind of measuring and marking off the places where I'm going to need to draw my lines, and then I'm just going to draw them in. It's a little hard to see them on the video, but just know that they are there. So I have my design all drawn out, and I've labeled my values on my reference image. Normally with acrylic painting, we would start with the darkest value, but for this project, I suggest starting with the lightest value and then moving on to the next lightest and then the next lightest and so on. I think it's just going to be easier for mixing the colors themselves. So because we're using the complement of blue to kind of desaturate it and make it darker and darker, or more and more desaturated, I'm going to mix a blue as my kind of base color. And then I can use orange from the tube, but I actually think that defeats the purpose of the assignment. We're wanting to learn about mixing colors. So I need to mix an orange as well that I'm going to then use to slowly add into my blue to desaturate it. So I'm going to mix an orange using red and yellow. I'm using the warm red and the warm yellow. And I need to make sure that I mix enough of both of these colors that's going to be able to cover the squares or the sections that need to be covered on my canvas. The worst possible thing is to mix a beautiful color and then it's not enough to actually cover the area that you need. Um, the challenge here is because I'm not using the paint out of the tube, is that when I do, I'm inevitably going to run out of these two colors. I'm going to have to kind of mix them both. So I've mixed this light blue with blue, the warm blue and white, and I'm just kind of comparing it to my value scale. I've painted a little swatch of it right below the lightest value, and I'm happy with that, and I'm going to use that for my lightest area, my lightest areas. So now I want to talk about how to make a nice crisp edge. So I'm using a square brush here, and as long as I don't have too much paint on my brush, I can use the top part of the bristles in this way where I'm kind of going sideways. And I can also do it with the top part of the brush. Another thing I could do is put out my pinky finger for balance, to kind of have something for my hand to press into. And they're not going to be perfect, but part of this project is learning brush control. It's a really good opportunity to kind of practice this stuff, and I feel like you'll be pleasantly surprised that you'll do better than you might have thought. So I've now finished my one section of the lightest value of blue. Now I'm going to grab my reference image again. I'm going to mix the next most desaturated value, or the next darkest value. And I'm going to look at where it's all located. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of this base color of blue, scoop it into a pile, and then I'm going to take a tiny bit of my orange that I've mixed, and I'm going to mix it in with this blue. And I mean like super tiny. We're going to do this incrementally. I'm going to mix, make sure it's very well integrated. And then I'm going to test it out on my sheet. I'm going to compare. I'm going to mix a little bit more. And I'm going to continue that process until I have a subtle difference. This project is all about having subtle differences in the saturation. So here, test it out and see if it's different enough. I've decided that it is, so I'm going to paint this section using the same technique with the edge of the square brush. I like to do the edges and then kind of like sweep outwards. You might have some issues still with paint opacity. We want to make these sections be pretty opaque where we're not seeing through the canvas underneath or to the paper underneath. So you may have to go back and do additional layers of paint depending on what type of paints you're using. For these outer sections, I really want to practice some blending. So I'm going to use my number 2 value, and I'm going to put a little tiny bit of the number 1 value along the edge where I believe the light would sort of hit. So it's going to just add a little bit of extra to that optical illusion. So remember, part of the success criteria is that we're able to use that blending technique, or those blending techniques, whatever techniques you're deciding to use. So I'm going to start with the darker value, and I'm going to go almost all the way up to the edge, the area where I want to be a little bit lighter. Then I'm going to wash my brush. I'm going to dry it. I'm going to use the lighter value now, and I'm going to paint it along the edge. I'm going to just rotate my canvas. It's a little bit easier for me. So I'm going to paint the lighter value. You can see the difference. I know with all the different shades and tones of blue, it's hard. But I've got my lighter value. I'm just going to swipe it along the edge all the way up to where my second blue value is. And then I want to blend. So I've wiped off my brush, I've cleaned it off, and I'm just going to use that brush that's kind of wet, but it's clean. And I'm going to swipe along where the two colors meet, and then I've got it blended pretty nicely there. It's very subtle. It's super hard to tell, but it makes a huge difference in the end. So decide on the sections in your composition where you're going to use the blending technique. And then don't forget to paint the edges. All right, it's time to desaturate that blue a little bit more. So I'm going to take my my darker blue that I made. I just mixed a teeny little bit more there. And I'm going to continue on with that process. I'm looking at my reference to see how much paint I need, how many sections I need to paint. And I've saved a little bit of that blue so that I can use it use it with the blending technique that I just showed. And I'm going to incrementally add a teeny little bit of orange and a little teeny bit more until I get a little bit more desaturated value that's different enough from my previous blue, that will look different enough that'll create that optical illusion that I want. So notice how long it's taking me to mix the colors. Mixing the colors is actually what takes the most time in this project. So I've got a little tester there. So this is going to go in the center, I think, and then also that one edge. So I'm going to still use that blending technique again. So we'll get to see it once again. So I'm going to just paint the whole section with my next blue value that's just a little bit more desaturated. I'm going to speed up the video a tiny bit until we get to the blending part. Right, so now I'm going to take that second blue value number 2. I find it very helpful to think of them as numbers. I'm going to swipe it along the edge right here, and I've gone right up to the edge with the number 3 blue value. And I want to make sure there's enough paint that when I swipe with my brush, I'm not wiping paint off and showing the canvas underneath. So I'm going, and then I'm washing my brush off, I'm drying it, and I'm swiping it with a clean but slightly wet brush. And that's how I kind of get that nice blended effect. So typically with acrylic painting, when we're blending, and when we're painting in general, we start with the darker values. But in this case, when I'm painting this one section, I'm going to do a teeny little bit of a lighter value first over along the top and the side of the square. I don't know, I just thought it would enhance the illusion. And then I'm going to blend in this number 3 value into it, and I'm just going to use exactly the same technique. So I've cleaned my brush off. I'm going to paint this whole area, and then I will brush with a clean dry brush. So the trick is also that you want to make sure that both of the colors that you're trying to blend are actually still wet when you're blending them, because it won't work if you allow the one color to dry. Okay, so I'm on value number 3, and I finally ran out of my light blue to mix with. So I'm just going to mix myself a little bit more, and we know it's going to be impossible to mix it exactly the same, but I'm going to just do my best to make it similar. I'm going to always compare it to my number 1 value on my value scale. So as I'm taking my brush and I'm just comparing it, and I noticed I actually need a bit more blue, quite a bit more blue. And at this point though, we can go slightly darker than our base because we're just going to continue to desaturate. So we're kind of playing a little bit with desaturating and also darkening the value. So if I add a bit more of my blue, it's going to make it darker, but it'll be more saturated. If I add more orange, it's going to make it desaturated, but not always necessarily darker, depending on the colors. So we can experiment as well with adding a little bit of black uh, at this point as well to darken. But we're trying to use it sparingly because the whole point of this project is to show how using neutrals can create a much richer color than just adding black. So I'm now working on value number 4, and so I'm using that light blue as the base, and then incrementally adding more and more orange. I'm comparing it to my value number 3, and then I'm gonna swatch it on my paper to check if it's gonna work for me. If you've swatched it on your paper and you're like, yes, this is great, this will work, and then you actually paint it onto the canvas and you're like, nope, too dark, or nope, too light, um, that's okay. You can always paint over it. And the other thing to consider too is that we're adding this in super slowly because it's the blue color it's kind of like a monochromatic blue painting. We're not wanting it to transform fully into orange for the darker value. The orange is just used to desaturate the blue and to darken the blue. So if your color is turning into the complement that you're mixing in, you've probably mixed too much. So by now, I feel like you know what the next step is. So I just have to mix my 5th and final value. And for this one, I am adding a little bit more orange and then a little bit of black, very, very little bit of black to kind of reach that darkness that I'm wanting. And then I will just paint my final sections and continue on with my blending technique around the edges where I want to use it. And I'm always comparing and swatching on my reference um, and continually making little adjustments. I'm just going to add a teeny little bit of blue back into it just to bring the saturation back a teeny bit. It also is going to darken it a little bit. Thing also to consider while you're working is that the paint is going to dry potentially darker than what it looks like as you're painting it. Um, and so you may have to make adjustments after you see what it looks like when it's dried. Another thing to consider is your choice of colors to use. So always we're picking from 2 complementary colors, but consider which one is kind of like your main color and which one you're using to desaturate. So for this, my main color is blue and I used orange to desaturate. I think that it's a little trickier to use a secondary color as your base color, as we're seeing here in this example. So I used green here, and then I added a little bit of red to desaturate. Because green is a secondary color, it took longer for me to mix, and it just added a little bit of extra complexity. So start with your primary color as your base if you're wanting a little bit more of a straightforward project. And yeah, in this design, I wanted to make my bright highlights along the kind of X in the center. And so that I felt would make it look like it's popping out a bit more. So yeah, this is our project and I cannot wait to see what you make.